I'm Afshin Ratansi and we're going underground as Theresa May today sends her UK Defence Secretary to the Munich Security Conference, attended by top Beijing officials after he announced the deployment of Britain's biggest warship to the South China Sea. Coming up on the show, as Nigerians go to the polls today, we ask the country's former culture minister who should lead the biggest oil-producing nation in Africa. And what will be the point of UK stealth bombers and swarms of drones to combat China and Russia? We de-orientalize neocon NATO attacks on Asia with former US Special Forces advisor Parik Khanna. Plus,
the Faroe Islands also have reason to celebrate food with some of the finest ingredients available from the ocean.
No need to worry about post-Brexit food supplies after an important trade deal signed with the North Atlantic archipelago of the Faroe Islands. All this and more coming up in today's Going Underground. But first, while NATO nation politicians trawl the corridors of today's Munich conference, how has one NATO nation leader attempted to make inroads into Africa's biggest oil-producing nation?
We begin here in Nigeria, where the British Prime Minister, Theresa May, has arrived in Nigeria as part of her trade mission to boost ties with Africa after Brexit.
The UK actually has a long tradition of interference in Nigeria, which elects a new leader today. The UK was involved in the Biafra War that killed up to 2 million people. And then there is that oil company with close relations to the British government.
Deep ties between Shell and the Nigerian state began when oil was discovered in the country in 1956. The state needed the vast wealth generated by Shell's oil production, and Shell needed access to the oil fields.
What could possibly go wrong? Well, on Tuesday, the widows of Nigerian activists executed by the Nigerian government accused Shell Oil of complicity in their deaths in a Dutch court. Most famous around the world is the writer Ken Saro-Wiwa, hanged in 1995. The controversy was addressed by incumbent Nigerian President Buhari recently.
President Buhari says he is aware of challenges in Ogoniland, many of which he believes would have been solved with more commitment and focus in the past, instead of awarding contracts that were not implemented.
But is that enough for Ogoniland, and who will do most for human rights when it comes to multinational oil contracts, let alone the use of Nigeria for NATO nation militarism in West Africa? Joining me now is a Nigerian politician who is culture minister and aviation minister. He was an advisor in President Obasanjo's PDP government, and he supports Obasanjo's former vice president, Atiku Abubakar, over incumbent President Buhari in today's elections. Femi Fani-Kayode is in the capital, Abuja. Thanks so much, Femi, for coming on. We had the former Nigerian Central Bank official Kingsley Moghalu on the show. He's supported by the Nobel laureate Wole Soyinka. He said that Nigeria needed a different kind of politics. Why are you supporting the PDP and Atiku Abubakar?
Well, first of all, I think that the suggestion that anybody other than Atiku Abubakar can defeat the incumbent is unrealistic. I mean, the reality is that the only person that has the opportunity and the chance of defeating Buhari is Atiku Abubakar. And quite apart from that, I think he's an excellent candidate, a good choice, somebody that has immense experience, and somebody that is more than likely will be able to bring the country back together again.
Obviously, Abubakar, a U.S. Senate report, accuses him of transferring $40 million of suspect funds to the U.S. using his American wife's account.
Well, the issue for me is very simple. He hasn't been indicted. He hasn't been convicted. These are allegations that have been made, until he's indicted, I really don't take them seriously. In any case, he was in America recently. If it was something that was that serious, why on earth wasn't he arrested? He is our leader in our party. He's running for election. We are supporting him. We're supporting the party. We have a major crisis in our country. We have to pull our country back from the brink. We're on the edge of what I would call a disaster, civil disorder, and possibly a civil war somewhere down the line if we're not careful. And we need somebody that can bring us back together again. And that, for me, is the overriding consideration, and that's why I'm supporting Atiku Abubakar.
Well, in London, obviously, we had pictures here of Theresa May with Buhari signing security deals, arms training deals. Obviously, Obama famously pictured with Buhari. Do you think the West has any chosen candidate?
It's a very, very complicated question. Simple on the surface, but complicated below. If you go back, 2015, I was very much involved in the presidential campaign then. I was spokesman for our then presidential candidate, President Goodluck Jonathan, who was president at the time. And it was very clear to us that Britain, the United States, and France particularly, and most of the Western nations were supporting Buhari, and they wanted Jonathan out of power. Obama spearheaded that, and Obama ensured that, and indeed told some of our government officials at the time that they would get Jonathan out at all costs. France was also, I believe it was Hollande that was the president at the time, and of course David Cameron in the United Kingdom. They all supported Buhari. They all wanted Jonathan out of power. But the problem is they really didn't know what they were getting into, and we warned them that this man is divisive. He's a Muslim fundamentalist. He seeks to impose Islam on the rest of the country. He's a believer in. He has an ethnic agenda, the Fulanization of the country. He's immensely unfit. Both mentally, physically, and spiritually to lead a country like this, because he sees everything from a prism of religion and everything from a prism of tribe. And we told them that. They didn't listen to us. They supported him. He became president of the country. And he's, you know, all we said over the last 3.5, at that time, has been proved over the last 3 years and 6 months. Now we are where we are today. And I would put it to you that I believe that the West has learned their lesson about Buhari. They've seen the carnage, they've seen the genocide, they've seen the ethnic cleansing, they've seen the persecution of political opponents, they've seen the wholesale destruction of our economy, the reduction of our people to poverty-stricken, pauperized people. We're now the world's poverty capital. I mean, every single aspect of our economy and our nation has been destroyed over that period, and they have recognized the fact, something we told them years ago, that a man like this will only encourage terrorism. He has supported Boko Haram by paying huge ransoms. Boko Haram is on the rampage. They are more powerful today than they were 4 years ago. The Fulani herdsmen, a terrorist organization of their own, he has never, ever condemned them, even though they have slaughtered more people than probably Boko Haram over the last 3.5 years. We also have ISIS in Nigeria now as a consequence of his espousal of fundamental Islamic doctrines. And we also have another group called the Malian Fulanis who are coming in to the northwestern part of the country, slaughtering our people in the north. That is the legacy of Buhari. And I think they've seen all that. That is, the Western leaders have seen all that and probably changed their minds and realized that we were right to have said they should keep this man out of power. And now they're probably looking at it from a different perspective. And it's very clear, because what they're saying now is they want a free and fair election. And they're saying this in the knowledge that Buhari will attempt to stay in power at all costs.
Okay, well, Buhari, obviously, and his cabinet and his politicians would no doubt deny a lot of those accusations and allegations you just made.
If I may just make a quick comparison here, because the challenges of Nigeria, our problems are not limited to just having another election and another president. It's a far more fundamental problem than that. And look at what happened in Syria. Look at what's happening in most of the Arab world. Look at what's happening in Libya. If we are not careful, we'll have something similar happening in this country, simply because you have a massive Christian population here, a massive Muslim population who are badly divided. And so it's a reality that thousands of people have been slaughtered over the last 3.5 years. Nobody can deny that.
Well, it's funny you mentioned Syria, because, of course, as you say, many different communities. But as for your candidate, he says, unless we dismantle mafia organizations, we cannot progress. Let's privatize them. Is your chosen candidate, Abu Bakr, basically, in a way, a bit like Bashar al-Assad before the war in Syria, wants to privatize everything, wants to bring in Western oil companies to, as his detractors would put it, just remove all the money from Nigeria and send it abroad?
Well, I think that's an oversimplification of what he's attempting to do. And again, I must emphasize, I am not his spokesperson. I do not speak for him. I'm not in his campaign organization. But I am a party member, and I'm a Nigerian. And I think that the road of privatization is a pretty good one. The record speaks for itself. The whole world is privatizing now. If not for the fact that, you know, Russia privatized, and of course they went through a number of challenges after the Soviet Union fell, but they privatized, and now they are what they are today, a relatively powerful country that's on the rise throughout the world. That is the road, that is the way forward. So I think to that extent, it's a pretty good policy. I also believe this, that you know, a country where government is so powerful and government is controlling enterprises like the NNPC and so on and so forth are bound to have challenges, because that's where corruption comes in, and that's why everybody is so interested in taking power at the center, because that's where all the money is, that's where all the assets are controlled by government. We should move away from that. Smaller government, more efficient system, and a booming economy. That's what we're trying to achieve, and that's what he wants to do.
You mentioned Russia. You know about the accusations that your chosen candidate, Abu Bakr, is connected to the Russians. He's hired the Donald Trump lobbyist Brian Ballard. Nonsense, those allegations?
Well, you know, I don't know who he's close to or who he's not close to, but what I will tell you is this. If you say he's close to the Russians, he's equally close to the Americans, he's equally close to the British, he's equally close to the European Union and everybody else. And I don't think it's a crime, or there's a crime in being close to the Russians. I admire the Russians. I like the Russians. I like the role they played in Syria. I like the fact that they supported and defended secularist governments and Christian communities, and even Shia minorities in Sunni Muslim countries, where Salafists and Wahhabists were funded by Saudi Arabia and, to a certain extent, the Obama regime to slaughter these people like flies. So I don't think there's anything wrong with being close to the Russians. I don't know whether he is close to the Russians, and I wouldn't for 1 minute suggest that he's in the pocket of the Russians. There's a complete difference between the two, but I don't think being close to the Russians is such a bad thing. I think it's good to be close to everybody, to talk to everybody. And I also believe that Russia should play a much bigger role in the affairs of Nigeria and indeed Africa.
Well, that'll raise a few eyebrows in NATO headquarters, let alone the EU. I've got to ask, you've presumably heard about the governor of Kaduna saying foreign intervention by the UK, EU and US in the election means that people will... from those places will be returning in body bags today if that happens. I've got to just ask, because you did suggest that Buhari will rig the election. EU officials are, of course, there on the ground today.
Listen, it's very important that you understand the mindset of the people that we're dealing with. And I would suggest to you, I'll put it to you, that that mindset is very close, very, very close to the mindset of the sort of people that were leading Al-Qaeda, that were leading ISIL, and that were leading various other terrorist organizations in the Arab world. When somebody like Nasser al-Rufai, somebody that I was very close to, we were in cabinet together for a number of years, the governor of Kaduna talks about body bags for interfering. And what he means by interfering is calling, you know, to question the partiality of, or the impartiality of INEC and the government in the conducting of this election. In other words, he doesn't want anybody to question anything. When he says that, you need to take him very, very seriously, because that's their mindset. This gentleman, in his state in 2016, 808 Christians were killed.
There is a peace accord the PDP
so the issue
signed.
is this. When he talks about body bags, take him very seriously, and we hope and pray that they don't go that far in their quest to stay in power. We sincerely hope that it doesn't come to that, but they're prepared to do anything, fight anybody, kill anybody, stop anybody, criminalize anybody, demonize anybody, including the West, in order to ensure that they stay in power. And by God's grace, they will fail in that quest.
Femi Fani-Kayode, thank you. After the break. As China rejects NATO nation mainstream media reports of talks with EU, US-backed Venezuelan rebels, we speak to a former US National Intelligence Advisor about why NATO nation media seeks to discredit Asia. And will Britain really just be eating Swiss cheese and Faroe Island fish after Brexit Day on March the 29th? All this and more coming up in part 2 of Going Underground. Welcome back. UK mainstream media this week asked questions about Jeremy Corbyn's baked beans and relied on barroom Brussels conversations for hints of Theresa May's Brexit timetable. But is the real question whether there will be tomatoes in British shops in April, let alone medicine? Because under the media radar, trade deals are already being done.
The government's programme for providing continuity and stability for businesses, consumers and investors in our international agreements is of utmost importance. We're committed to ensuring these benefits are maintained, providing for a smooth transition as we leave the EU.
So nearly 3 years on from the referendum, who has the UK signed deals with?
We have already signed a number of agreements, including with Switzerland, the largest in terms of our trade flows, representing over 20% in terms of value of all our rollover agreements.
Yes, Swiss clocks and fondue are safe. Who else have we signed off with?
We've also signed agreements with Chile and the Faroe Isles.
The Faroe Islands are apparently a significant post-Brexit trade partner. This is what's on their YouTube channel.
With a history deeply influenced by ancient Vikings and the struggle for survival, the Faroes have a rich past.
And a rich future as the Faroe Islands sell Britain advanced technology and pharmaceuticals, presumably. But back to reality. Is the problem that Theresa May's government is useless at negotiation? Labour claims the Tories approached trade deals by saying at the outset they want to turn Britain into a duty-free port. Not the best strategy in rolling over import and export taxes.
Recently, the Secretary of State suggested the unilateral liberalisation of tariffs in the event of a no-deal Brexit. I ask the Secretary of State to explain to the House now how he thinks negotiations would go with the remaining rollover countries once he'd given up our key negotiating leverage by reducing all tariffs to zero. Most members might think that by doing so, we were the ones being rolled over.
Far from it, says the UK government, and in any case, the UK will surely be able to sell weapons, hot on the heels of a UK Defence Secretary threatening China and Russia this week. Here's the PM paying tribute to a warplane alleged by Amnesty International to be involved in child killing by Saudi Arabia, let alone its arguably illegal use in Iraq and Syria.
From the Gulf War through to operations against Daesh in Syria and Iraq, the Tornado has been an integral and vital part of our AF operations. And I think, as my right honourable friend, the Defence Secretary, said last week, it's with a heavy heart but enormous pride that we bid farewell.
Theresa May celebrating the bombing of Asia there. We're joined now by former US National Intelligence Advisor Parag Khanna. His new book is The Future is Asian: Commerce, Conflict and Culture in the 21st Century. Parag, welcome back to Going Underground. So, all we hear about in NATO nation media, arguably, is, these economies in the East, they're going downhill, let alone China. We have Mahathir back in Malaysia. Who knows, capital controls. And yet you're saying the future is Asian.
Let me double down on the argument, actually. I could have called this book The Present is Asian. That's just less catchy a title, but it happens to be true. 40% of the world economy is Asian. 50% of the world population is in Asia. Asia trades more within itself than it does with the rest of the world. It's even decoupling in so many ways. Some of the world's largest economies are, of course, in Asia. China is, in purchasing power parity terms, which is the measurement that matters, the largest economy. India is now growing faster than China. ASEAN, the countries of Southeast Asia, have half the population of India and China. They have a larger GDP even than India, and get more foreign investment than China. So not only is Asia the present and the future, right? It has multiple pillars of growth. A lot of people look at Asia and they see just China and whatever China wants, and China writ large. In fact, there are significant major multi-trillion-dollar economies in Asia that are very nicely exploring their complementarities with each other economically and strategically. So I think that there's a lot of bumps on the road to an Asian century, but there's no question that we already live in it.
What do you make of Britain's role then at the moment? Just recently, the Chinese government warned Britain of provocative actions. HMS Albion in the South China Sea. Theresa May, minority government leader here, openly saying, we don't support the Belt and Road Initiative. Britain doing some useful things here in this future is Asian world you portray?
There are two things going on in terms of Britain. In the post-Brexit landscape, the UK really does need to strengthen its economic ties to Asia. Germans, French, Italians, Swiss, everyone is actually trying to get in on Belt and Road projects. The UK, to use another example, has also the Prosperity Fund. The purpose of the Prosperity Fund is also to get British business a leg up in fast-growing economies like India, like Pakistan. So whatever Theresa May says about Belt and Road is more or less irrelevant. What matters a lot more is what are Europeans doing, Britain included, to try and shape the local environments through their businesses and through their diplomacy. And in that, Britain should do a lot more. Its presence of its warships is not nearly as significant ultimately in influence, because it really isn't very influential from a military standpoint. What it can do commercially will have a bigger impact.
To get some comment from the Royal Navy on that one. But it has to be said that, and we've heard it on this program, it's been quoted widely around the world, that the United States is encircling China with military bases. Is that
Let's
why
remember-
London and other countries are going, we can't be too close to the Communist Party of China?
The U.S. military presence in the region long predates China's rise, right? It's a legacy, obviously, of World War II and the victory over Japan and so forth. And since that time, during the Cold War, the U.S. alliance system, the ANZUS agreements, countries like, of course, Japan and South Korea, also Australia, New Zealand, and others, were formally a part of a U.S. treaty-based alliance system, and a lot of that remains intact today. There's shifting, positions and degree of acceptance of a strong military presence in places like Japan and Korea, because of course they've modernized, they've become very successful, they have their own self-defense capability. To some degree, they still want the U.S. there. To a certain extent, though, they also feel it's politically unpalatable, and that's what's being negotiated right now. But all of them, obviously, are concerned with China's rise, China's massive investments in its military, China's posture and movements in the South China Sea, island reclamation and fortification of islands and placing military facilities there. So there is a tit-for-tat escalation, a maneuvering that's going on. I hope that it can be managed in a way where if we resolve the underlying territorial disputes over the islands, and if we agree that the waters have to remain open, but after we've settled the status of the islands, there isn't a need for this endless escalation. That's what we should all want.
Obviously, the world is now looking on, and at the UN Security Council, it was said it's not the international community, it's a minority of governments that are trying to overthrow the government of Venezuela. What do you make of the Chinese saying, this is Hua Chunying, the Chinese Foreign Ministry, saying China will continue to support the government's efforts to safeguard Venezuela's national sovereignty? Obviously, there's been masses of 28 cooperation agreements between China and the Maduro government, masses of energy deals, and obviously Chinese weapons going to Venezuela.
Rhetorically, that language isn't that different from what China uses with respect to other countries, where it has made significant investments, purchased a lot of energy, sold a lot of weapons, issued lines of credit, and so forth. So China has done that in any number of countries, and Venezuela is one of them. So that rhetorical statement is not at all surprising. But remember, you're talking about a country of more than 50 million people. No foreign power can prop up a failing government, that has messed up policy and, screwed up their most significant natural resources and assets.
That sounds a bit like what McNamara might have said about Fidel Castro in Cuba.
No, what I'm saying is that, again, Venezuela has been failing on its own volition, right? It's made a lot of mistakes. I don't know about you, but
that's highly controversial, obviously, because U.S. sanctions, EU sanctions are existing against.
Again, I've been going to Venezuela for actually, 15 years since my first book and written about it. And I and many other people who are actually Latin America specialists would have said the seeds of its own decay were sowed by the Chavez regime and the way he handled the economy and the way he handled the energy assets. So my point is that whether you're China, Russia, or whichever other power, you really can't keep that state from failing with the current government that it has. Obviously, China's sentiment, again, which is consistent in what they say in other contexts too, is that they don't want to see an arbitrary overthrow of the government, without some kind of negotiated process, for changing it.
So really, you think China, let alone Russia, which I'll get onto, they could be part of a process to get rid of the Bolivarian revolution and put in
I wouldn't really call it a
Washington-backed-
successful, but no, and it wouldn't be. What I'm saying is that they would want to see a negotiation, not a lawless overthrow, right? Because if it is inevitable, and in the case of Syria, we've had a similar situation where, of course, there was a sense years ago at this point, if we look back at how much longer Assad has lasted than people had originally thought, that he must go. But
When
of
you
course,
say people originally thought, do you mean the sources you're using?
No, I'm referring to the same people that you do when you talk about, the Western press that tends to just assume that bad guys will fall and fail, and they tend to have greater longevity. But again, I'm saying that whatever oil purchase agreements China, has with Venezuela, it's not enough at this point to keep 50 million people or to restore them to the dignity that they once had, right? Something else has to change in the country's politics and policy. That's the point I'm making. And in fact, despite those statements from China, over the last couple of years, it's sort of, if you will, decelerated its support for the country. It sees that it's kind of a losing proposition.
It's 28 new cooperation agreements, tripling of oil exports within the past 6 months. And,
from where they had fallen to, let's remember.
Right, but I mean, there's Chinese Communist Party involvement in energy via the Sinovensa project. I mean, what I'm trying to get at, I suppose, is the developing nations in the world, let alone the Asian nations, you don't think they see Venezuela a bit like Russia, Soviet Union might have seen the Cuban Missile Crisis?
No, I don't think so, because in a way, and it was a testament, you were saying earlier, to Castro's longevity. This government in Venezuela does not have the longevity of Fidel Castro, right? Its predecessor didn't either, and it seems to know that. It's not, people used to actually admire the Castro regime in Cuba for, the sense of equality and the universal health care and these kinds of things. You know very well what the humanitarian conditions are in Venezuela. It's nothing to admire. I want to make a broader point. China, in the case of Venezuela or others, actually makes very rational calculations, a cost-benefit analysis as to whether or not countries are useful to it, right? If you look across Africa, again, the same nameless blob, if you will, of Western press talks about China colonizing Africa and so forth. Just to be clear, China is diminishing its commitments to some African countries from which it's no longer, purchasing as much commodities as it used to. Places like Angola, where it used to buy a lot of oil, doesn't buy as much anymore. So you don't have as much Chinese presence. The lesson there is that geopolitics is quite non-linear. You can't just paint a straight line picture from China has invested in these 5 countries, therefore China will colonize Africa. Nothing of the sort is what is happening, right? Chinese investments are concentrated in about 5 countries in Africa, not 53, right? And it will vary and shift based upon its own interests. And that's something that is, much more predictable in many ways and much more analytically something you can analyze rather than just some ideological notion that China must be all over Africa. So Venezuela needs to be seen in that context as well. How useful is it going to be?
Farrakhan, thank you. That's it for the show. We'll be back on Monday to speak to a man nominated by members of the US Congress for this year's Nobel Peace Prize for his work with North Korea. Until then, keep in touch via social media. See you on Monday.